Alright, what is up, guys? In this episode, we're going to be focused on GraphQL. But before we dive deep into it, there are some things that we need to know about GraphQL. Um, I got this slideshow that I had created because I wanted to jot down some questions that might be helpful as to why we need to know a little bit more about GraphQL or why somebody wants to get into it. So the three main questions is the what, the why, and the how. All right. So what is GraphQL? It's a syntax language that describes how to ask for data. Also, instead of using multiple endpoints like REST, it has one endpoint that it uses to query for your data, right? So you know how REST has multiple endpoints like API slash students, and then you got API slash students slash schools. Now that's two endpoints that you would have to request data from when the two the two the students in the schools are related to each other, but you still have to make two separate requests to get the data back from the student, right? So that's how REST works. But instead, GraphQL works is that if you have one endpoint, which is slash GraphQL, and then after that you just query out your database for any other data that you actually need. Okay, so that's what GraphQL is. It makes it simple so you don't have to make multiple um, endpoints. All right, so unless you query for the data, that's basically what it is. All right, so the why comes in, and you would think that why would you need to use GraphQL? Well, for one, it limits the requests we need to make to the server. So in REST, by you having to make different requests to different endpoints, that means multiple requests to the server, and that can slow down the performance of it, because when you make too many requests, it it starts to slow down your app, right? So that's not ideal. Another one is that it builds, well, the second one builds on top of, oops, sorry. The second one here builds on top of the first one main endpoint to query your data from, which is good. You don't have to have multiple endpoints, just using one. And the third thing is that you only get data back that you want. Okay. Now in REST, if you try to go to an endpoint to get back some data, it's going to give you like a crap load. But you're not going to use all of that data that it gets back. Most likely you're only going to be using a few properties that you need to actually use in your app, but you still get this whole list of data back, which sometimes it can be, a drag, because then you have to loop through all of them and only get the ones you want, right? Now with GraphQL, you can specify the specific data that you actually want. You don't get back unnecessary data that you don't need for your app. You only get back what you asked for, basically, right? Now that we figured out the what and the why, now it goes to the how. Now, how do you create a GraphQL API? Well, it consists of using the schema, the queries, and the resolvers. And of course, other things play a part in this as well, but the main ones are building the schema, creating the queries, and the resolvers, which are basically the actions. Well, resolvers are basically what the data returns. The queries specify what the data should return, and then the resolvers return the data that you're actually going to use, right? So that's what that is. But we'll get more into it when we get to the code, right? So that's some things that I want to jot down that we need to know about GraphQL. And then in this next slide is just listed out a few things that we're going to do in this episode, which is build out the schema with the queries and the mutations, and then we're going to build some dummy data. Now the dummy data is basically going to be an array of objects, but we're using GraphQL, we're going to be able to push some items to that array and get the data back from it, okay? And then we're going to create some resolvers, which are what's going to return the data for us. And then we're going to test these we're going to test these queries using the built-in GraphQL. I can't really say that word. GraphQL. We're going to test the queries using that Postman-like feature that's built into our code that we had into our code, right? So that's the agenda of what we're going to do today, all right? So let me exit out of this. Quick 2 slides for you. I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code here. I'm going to make it big, so I make this bigger. There we go. So I made some comments on what we're going to be doing in each section. In this first part right here, we got to require the build schema method, because GraphQL comes with a build schema method that you can use to build out your data, basically. So we're gonna get that. We're gonna get that going. We got to require that in there. So we're gonna grab it right out of GraphQL. That's why we're using the destructuring here. So build schema equals require GraphQL. So we got that from GraphQL, right? So we're gonna use that in a second. The create dummy data, what we got to do is do const data. It's going to be an array of objects, right? So I have 3 so far. And what I'm going to do, I'm using alt option, and then I'm clicking the areas that I want to do multiple, so I can do multiple values. Well, so I can do all the values, and so it won't be like slow me doing it one by one. So I'll do 1, and then it'll have a first name. I'll say Tim. I'll change him. Last name. I'll say Alan. And then I'll say fave color. It's gonna be blue. No. Fave color. Crap. Let me do that. Fave color is actually going to be an array of colors. So blue, pink, and teal. Alright, so if we save that, we get an array of objects. We just got to change the fields here. I think that's how you spell Freddy Krueger. Alright, so we built out the dummy data. So this is the array of objects that we're going to append another object to, and then we're going to get data out of, along with fave color, right? Now that we got that out of the way, let me close that tab up a little bit. So the next thing we got to do is we actually got to build the schema, okay? Build the queries and the mutations and all of that stuff, right? Resolvers is not included. Resolvers is actually by itself. It's not inside the build schema method that we're about to create, okay? So we'll say const, we got to give it a name, const, I'll say our schema, like that. It's going to be equal to build schema. And then as you can see right here, the source, which is basically like the info, it's going to be type of string, so it has to be a string, right? So we can use the backticks to do our datas and all that. I tried using string like this and tried doing it, but I don't think it worked very well. Type query. Yeah, I tried doing like, well, it might, but I've seen a lot of developers use the backticks. So I'm going to use the backticks in this one, alright? I'm going to put it on a separate line so you can see it better. Like this, right? Now, our schema has to have types, right? So the reason why that has types is because you got to know which one's a query and which one's a mutation. So that's why you have to have type, right? And each type is basically an object. So type query is an object with all the queries in it. Type mutation is the object with all the mutations that you want to do, okay? Now mutations is just mutations are like functions that you use to modify the data that you have, like change it up, like add stuff, delete stuff from it, update stuff from it. So that's what mutations does. It's mutating the data, right? So now the queries, actually not a, I don't think it's a capital. I think it's type query. Yeah. So type query is the object, right? And to test this out, I'm going to see if it actually works like this, right? So type query, and then we'll put name, and then the name is going to be a string. Now the queries are basically all of your, kind of like all of your endpoints that you describe. It's the data that you're going to describe, okay? So that might not make sense, but you'll see in a second. So I have a name that's a string, right? It's supposed to return a string. So this is me describing what this name field is. So this name field is supposed to return a string, okay? I'm describing what it's supposed to return. Now, now when I go to create resolvers, remember I said resolvers return that data of whatever query you're asking for, okay? It actually returns that data, right? So we can do this. This is how it's all put together. We'll say const resolvers or resolver. Now resolver is just an object that has the functions that are the same name as the queries, okay? You'll see in a second what I mean by that. So I'll create a resolver called name. It has to be the same name as the query. And then it's gonna return an arrow function. And this arrow function is gonna return hello, it's working. Like that, right? Now the reason I did that, because you have to make it, the resolver name has to be the same name as the query. And whatever you specify the data that it returns, it has to return that data. So you said that it was going to return a type of string, so it has to return a string, okay? So if I return a number, it's going to throw an error because you already specified that it was going to return a string, okay? So now let's just see if that's working, alright? So let's go over here. Let me resize this for real quick. And then I think I have my server going. Let me see. I probably don't. So let me cd into my desktop real quick. Cd into the project. And then let me do yarn start. And I get an error. Schema is not defined. Oh, okay. So our schema is not defined because when we called it our schema, we need to pass it into our schema like we did in the other tutorial. So our schema, like that. Okay, so now the server is running. We always got to put our schema in here and our resolvers. Okay, which is resolver, same thing. It's referencing this. Okay, and our schema is right there. So we got to put that in there. I explained that in my previous tutorial. Okay, so we got that working. Now if we go to localhost 5000 / GraphQL, because that's our root one. Option must contain a schema. Oh, I probably have to put schema and then our schema. like that. There we go. Okay, so let me clear this out. Okay. Alright, so we cleared that out, right? So what we're gonna do now, this is our editor like to test out our endpoints, okay? So we're testing out the endpoints that we just created, okay? This is similar to like how Postman is for REST, like I said earlier. But GraphQL, they use this one to test out our endpoints. Alright, so we're going to pull up this real quick, right? And so what we have to start off with is these brackets here. Now we could do query, so you can better see it. Query, because that's what we're doing, we're querying. But then, okay, so this query means this query that I put right here. But if I don't put it, it's going to be equal to whatever data that we want to grab right now. Okay, so I'm not going to put it. But the query means that you're about to grab what data that you want, right? So for this one, we made a query for the name. Now this is a field, okay? The field is called name, right? So when we put name here, as you can see from the URL, that the name is right here. So you're querying for the name that we just put in, right? So when we click play, it should return what the resolver, whatever the resolver says that we're going to return is what's going to return. So it should return hello, it's working. Okay? So if we click play here, oh wait, I think I have to put the brackets. Query type must be provided. I thought I did that already. So let me see. Query root type must be provided. Oh, I think it's capital. Capital Q for query. Okay. Let me refresh that. Okay, so now I can get rid of the brackets. There we go. Okay, so the data you get back is whatever the resolver returns is the data you're going to get back, okay? So the name returned, hello, it's working, right? And it has to be capital Q for query for it to work, because then it won't work, okay? So then if we create another one that's called, let's create another one called messages, right? And that's going to be, it should return, this is basically saying what it should return. It should return an array of string. Okay? So now the resolver actually has to return that data. So it has to be the same name, messages. Okay? That's the field, and now it's going to return, arrow function. It's going to return an array of messages, right? So then I can do an array and say hello. It's working. Again. Okay, so those are an array of strings. Okay, because we specified that it was going to return that. Alright, so if we go here, now this is not nested, so we have to make a separate query for that. Now if I try to do name and then turn around and do, now I'm not grabbing anything out of name because name is just a string. It's not an object that you can grab data from. So if I was to go message, okay, yeah, see, it's not showing up because it thinks that I'm trying to grab info from the name. So when you go back and do message, did I refresh it? Is that why it's not popping up? Let's see. Okay. messages. Sorry. There we go. I named it messages, right? So we query for this data. It should return whatever the resolver returns, and the resolver returns an array of string. Alright? So if we look at it, boom, it returns an array of string. That's in messages, right? So that's how that works, right? So now, say like I had some real data, okay? So like I had some real data. Say like I had a student, right? Now students, okay? Now students is going to return an array of student. Okay? And then if I say colleges, no, if I say school, it's going to be an array. We can do like an array of schools. An array, schools. Okay, let me see. Now let me see. I'm trying to have like associated data. So if we have students, and now we have, it's going to return an array of students. So now we have to create this type, right? So we don't have to do type query or nothing like that. Just name the type that you called it. So type student. And now you're describing what data that's going to have. So it's going to have an ID. That's type ID, which comes from GraphQL. That's not me just making up the ID. That's coming from GraphQL. Provides you with an ID. Oh crap. Like that, right? Say the student has a first name, and that's going to be a string. So making a string type, copy that. For last name, that's going to be a string, okay? And now, if we delete that for a second, and then we have students, so now we got to make sure that this data returns that, right? So we're going to say student because it has to be the same name. Students is going to return our function. It should return an array of student, right? So which is the data. Now I'm thinking about it. Because remember how we had the first name, last name, and data, right? We'll get to the favorite color in a minute. But we can return this data that actually returns the students because I matched it up. So it can return the data. Return that array of objects, right? Alright? So now, if we go here, refresh it, you always got to refresh it so it can start fresh. And then we go to students. It auto completes for you. See, and it, when you click play, it automatically, if you don't put any data inside of it, it'll automatically take out the ID for you if you don't put any data that you want to specify, that you want out. So it grabs out the ID, okay, now say, and it returns, it's returning this data right here. That's just what it's returning, okay. Now if I didn't want the ID, and if I just wanted the first name, I could play. Oh, the first name is null. Let's see here. Oh, I spelled first name wrong. Okay, so let's spell that right. First name. That would help. Alright, so if you refresh that again and say that I only want the first name out of students, it gives you the first name. Okay. Now if you want the last name too out of that students array, it gives you the last name. Alright. And if you don't want the first name, you just want the last name, boom, it gives you the last name. Okay. So that's how that works. Now the next thing we got to do, I probably went way off schedule here. Okay, so the next thing we got to do is that we got to do the mutations, right? So we exit all this out. I just wanted to test it. I just wanted to show you that you can do data like that. Okay, so let's clear this out real quick. And now we're going to do the mutations. So in mutations, it has to be type mutation, right? And this query is going to be named, what is it, people? I'm going to call it people. And this should return an array of person. Yeah, like that. Okay. Now we have to create that type. We have to do type person, describe what the person fields are going to have. It's going to have the ID. It has to be the same as this array up here because we're going to have to push objects to this array here. So then first name, which is going to be a string, type string, and then the last name is going to be type string, right? And then the mutation is basically what do you want to modify out of this data, right? So you want to do add person. We'll just give it a name because that's what we're doing. So you're gonna have to give it a name of what actually you're going to be doing. So add person, right? Now here's the tricky part. When you want to do inputs and you're adding to the data, right? There's a type that comes from GraphQL that's called input. That's called input, right? Now input is an object, and you have to specify basically the parameters that you're going to be creating. So that might sound confusing, but just check it out. So when you have type input, you go first name, it's going to be type string, and then you go last name. So these basically say what values are you using to basically, like, so the input, let me make this clear. So the input is basically like the input values on a form. You know how you have input values on a form and somebody's typing in their first name, their last name, or somebody's typing in their login and their password fields, like on a form. These are basically what it's saying. So you're going to have a first name field input, and then you're going to have a last name field input. And these got to be type string. Okay, that's all basically type input does. It specifies the fields that you have. Okay, so now it specifies the fields that you have, and then you want to input that into our add person. Okay, so we're gonna do the input. You attach that onto the add person, and then, if I'm not mistaken, hold on, let me double check. let's see. Let me make sure I got it right. Okay. Okay. So the input is the type string, right? Because they're type strings. And then this should return a string. Okay? Right. So then when we go here to resolvers, we have to do the add name, add person, sorry. And then that's gonna return. Now these are like parameters. The input is like parameters in this mutation, right? So we have to grab those parameters out of this function here. So we're gonna have to destructure it. We can just grab them straight out and just grab the input like that. And then it's gonna return and once you grab the input out of that, that input is looking at this input, and this input is looking at this input, okay, which is looking at these values here. So we'll say we have to create an object, right? So we do const person. It's going to be equal to an object. We're going to push this object onto our array once we get done, okay? So that's what we're doing here. We're basically creating an object. So this object right here is going to have the values that's similar to our data right here, okay? So we have the ID, which is going to be 3. We can do, the IDs are kind of going to be off a little bit because I haven't figured out how to do IDs yet. What is this data called? Data? Okay, data dot length. Yeah, I'll do data dot length, right? And then for the first name, it's going to be whatever you type in when we do the GraphiQL. So it's going to be input. Okay, so the input. So whatever the input dot first name is. Right? And then the last name is going to be input, which is that, right? Input dot whatever the last name is, which is what we're going to put in there, okay? So we created that object, right? Now we have to push this object to our array, our data array. So right here we'll do data dot push, and then we're going to push that new person object onto there. Person. I'm going to push that new person object onto there, right? And then we got to return something, right? So the resolvers always have to return the data that you want for that query, right? So for this add person, well, either for a query or a mutation, but for the add person mutation, we have to return what the data should be back. So we have to return the data because we just pushed a new object onto this data. So we want to return that data so we can see all of the objects that are in it now since we added an object to it, right? So now if we go here, sorry about that. If we go here and we refresh it, okay? Now if we go to if you go to data, let's try it out. Let's actually, hold on, let me see. Return data, person. Okay, that's the mutation. Now we don't have a person to return because people are supposed to return an array of person, which is the same as our data. So we have to do that query first. So we do person, people. Hope this is not confusing. We gotta do people, and then people is gonna return the data. Okay, that's what people's gonna return, and then add person is gonna mutate that data by adding another object to it. Okay, refresh that again. Now if we query for the people, we hit go, there we go. It's gonna give us an array back of the data, right? So if we go first name, so we can see it's first name, right? It's the same one as our data object. It's the same, it's bringing back us the same data, right? But now we're trying to mutate it, right? So we're gonna cross this out, and we're gonna change this to a mutation, because this is what we want to add. So we go mutation, right? And then we add what we call the mutation. Mutation is called add people. There we go. Add person. Sorry. And then we're going to pass in the parameters, because we made the parameters the input, which is the first name and the last name. Okay, so we got to, that input is going to be type of string, so whatever we type in there, it has to have the first name and the last name, right? So if we go input, oh, I see what I did. Okay, so input is an object. Now you're probably thinking, what? Okay, let me show you. So input is an object, right? Input is this input, and this input is an object of first name and last name. So the input is an object, right? And it should return a string, which it is, because the first name is a string and the last name is a string, okay? So if we put in first name, or if we put, first name, and that has to be a string, so we'll say a different name here. We'll say Tommy, and then we put in the last name, and we'll say strong, right? We didn't pass in the ID, because the ID is going to be whatever the array length is, okay? So we got the first name and the last name of the inputs, right? Now, if we click play on this, it's going to add this object to our people array, okay? So if we click play, schema is not configured for mutations. Well, that was an epic fail. Let's see. See what's going on here. Cons person. Oh, do I have to make it a capital M? Let's retry that. Type string. Okay. So it works. It's just now that I did my data, it's looking not right. Let's see. Expected type string. Looks like a string to me. Let me try. See. It should return a string. No. Okay, see, I messed up here. The mutation part, right? This mutation shouldn't return a string. See, this is why it looked awkward to me. It shouldn't return a string. The input should be type string because of those, but it shouldn't return a string. It should return our data, right? So it should return what data we're trying to turn. It should return our people data. So it should return people, if I'm not mistaken. So let's refresh that. Oh, an array of people. Person. An array of person. It should return an array of person. Okay, so get these curly brackets out of there. The ID. I know I didn't spell first name wrong. I'm thinking, is it first name dot input? So you get the first name and then get the input of it. I could have sworn I had it right the first time. Let's try that. Alright. When in doubt, look it up. Okay. Mutation. Let me put that back because that might be right. I think it's something up here that there was wrong. Okay, so maybe, okay, let me see. Person input. Person input, and it should return a person, an array. Input type. Must be. See, this is debugging at its finest. Must be input type. I thought I did that. Oh, okay, I did that wrong. Okay, so type input. Okay, so it's not type input. Okay, so it's not type input, it's just input, and then the name you give that input. So input, and then the person input. So input is person input. There we go. Okay. Alright, so what I did here was, that was some debugging I had to do there. Okay, so let me rephrase this so you guys can better understand it. The input is it's a type, but it doesn't put the type first. It's just called input. Okay. Now whatever you name the input, that's the name you have to pass in here. So when you do in the parameters and you say that the add person has an input type, and it's going to be asking, what input type is it? You say it's the person input. So when you do input here, and you do input like here, you have to pass in the values here that it has. So input is an object with the first name and last name, right? And so that's why when input here, you have to put it in the object in the values of the first name and last name, okay? And that's what it's passing in. That's what it's grabbing. And the part that it returns, it's not returning a string. You're returning that array of person, okay? And we already said that the array of person is to the people field, to the people query. So when you query people and you get an array of person, it's basically saying right here, the people is going to return the array of objects. And that's what it's going to return. The person, the array of objects, basically, or data, basically, okay? So whatever returns here is the same thing that's going to return here when you add that person. And then we made it sure that it returns our array of objects that's up here. So that's what it's returning on both ends. It's returning that for here, and it's returning it for here, okay? So I hope that wasn't confusing. I just had a little debugging that I had to do, but it's okay. I got it all on there. Of course, send me any messages or comments if this is confusing whatsoever, because I had to really, really research to understand how this is done. This might come like in hella confusing at first, but you'll get used to it, and it'll gradually, come. You just gotta start researching about it, looking up blog posts. I have like tons and thousands of blog posts that I did trying to figure this stuff out. It's actually not that hard, but I learn differently, so it might come a little difficult for me. So I hope it doesn't come as difficult for you, and I hope I didn't explain it too harsh. But yeah, that's what it's doing. So this is like this is basically like overall what you're going to be doing using GraphQL, and how you're going to be able to get data, return data, use the input to add data to whatever array you're doing. This is the input to add data, pass it in as parameters, and then returning that array again. So you're going to be doing a lot of this. We haven't touched on the database yet. I haven't created Mongo. I haven't not created. I haven't installed MongoDB or Mongoose or nothing like that. I haven't did that yet. We're going to be doing that. I just want to get familiar with GraphQL because it's new. It's new, and I'm not that familiar with it, so I wanted to get familiar with it first before I start diving deep into other things, So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play around with it and get an idea of how it works and how to use it. And in the next one, we'll either do more of it, or we'll start implementing, getting our app done, and using the data to, get our app data in there. Doing our app. This is like to test it out, to get familiar with it. Feel free to play around with it on the documentation, because the documentation is actually pretty darn good. So get familiar with that. I watched a lot of videos on it. I suggest you watch a lot of videos and get used to it. Get used to the syntax and everything like that. And then in the next one, I should be able to start implementing our app with using the knowledge that we do know now. So that's what I plan on doing for the second one. Not the second one, for our next episode. That's what I plan on doing. But for now, I'm going to end this video, and I hope it helped you guys out. If it does, hit that like button. And I will see you guys in the next one.